Welcome to Sherlock Midnight Echo, where every whisper hides a chilling mystery.
The first sharp breath of a December frost had settled over St. Mary Mead, threading silver needles through the barren hedgerows and crusting the vicarage lawn with a crisp, brittle white. Despite the chill, the spirit of community and a formidable amount of village gossip refused to be dampened. At Downes House, the grand Elizabethan estate perched at the edge of the village, Colonel Arthur Wainwright and his fiercely energetic sister, Lady Camilla, were hosting the annual St. Mary Mead Winter Garden Party. Traditionally an event held in the fragrant warmth of June, Camilla had insisted upon a winter incarnation, complete with spiced mulled wine, flickering torches, and a sprawling marquee pitched upon the frozen terrace. In the corner of the conservatory, half shielded by a cascading fern and a magnificent display of winter cyclamen, sat Miss Jane Marple. Her hands moved with quiet, rhythmic precision, knitting a pale wool scarf for the church bazaar, while her pale blue eyes surveyed the bustling room with the gentle, detached benevolence of an elderly aunt. "It is all terribly grand, of course," murmured Mrs. Dolly Bantry, leaning over with a confidential whisper as she adjusted her heavy velvet collar. "Though I cannot fathom why Camilla insisted on outdoor heaters when the wind off the common could peel the paint off a cottage door. And look at poor old Reverend Abbott. He has already tried to balance 3 mince pies on a saucer while chatting with Mrs. Calthorpe. Disaster waiting to happen." "Indeed, my dear Dolly," Miss Marple replied softly, her needles clicking together with a soft clack-clack. "Men are remarkably helpless creatures when confronted with delicate pastry and polite conversation. Though I suspect Colonel Wainwright has more pressing concerns on his mind today than the catering." Mrs. Bantry blinked, her curiosity instantly piqued. "Oh, you've noticed something, Jane? Has Arthur been losing heavily at bridge again?" "Not bridge, I think," Miss Marple said, her gaze drifting across the crowded terrace toward the edge of the rose garden, where a bitter wind whipped through the frozen trellis. "People are rather like garden plants, aren't they? One nurtures them, feeds them, prunes away the unsightly bits, and yet, beneath the rich soil, worms will always find a way to the roots. Some secrets simply refuse to stay buried beneath the winter frost." Outside, against the festive strains of a gramophone playing carols from the drawing room, the merry gathering laughed, clinked glasses, and traded pleasantries. None of them, not the ambitious young solicitor Mr. Henderson, nor the brooding nephew Julian Wainwright, nor even the sharp-eyed parlour-maid carrying silver trays, suspected that the final guest of the afternoon had already arrived, wrapped in the silent, suffocating cloak of winter. The afternoon sun hung low and bruised over the frosted battlements of Downes House, casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns that sloped toward the copse. Inside the sprawling marquee, the air was thick with the scent of pine boughs, damp wool and roasting chestnuts, mingling uneasily with the faint, expensive perfume of eau de cologne worn by Mrs. Evelyn Vance. Evelyn stood near the makeshift bar constructed from old oak barrels, engaged in what appeared to be a delightfully animated conversation with the local magistrate, Sir Reginald Croft. Yet, as Miss Marple observed from her quiet vantage point behind the cascading fern, Evelyn's laughter never quite reached her eyes. Instead, they darted repeatedly toward the side entrance of the conservatory, where the heavy velvet curtains stirred ominously in the draught. "It's Julian I worry about," Mrs. Bantry murmured, returning to the bench with a replenished glass of mulled cider that threatened to slop over the brim. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial hiss, leaning in so close that the artificial cherries on her hat bobbed in rhythm with her concern. "The boy has been brooding in London for 6 months, and the moment he returns, Arthur acts as though a bailiff is standing at the door. Did you see the way they glared at each other by the dessert table, Jane? Like 2 terriers over a single mutton bone. I wouldn't be surprised if Arthur is cutting him out of the will entirely. After all, with the estate taxes being what they are, and Julian's rather extravagant habits in town, money is a singular catalyst for family friction, isn't it, Dolly?" Miss Marple remarked gently, slipping a stitch with practiced ease. "Though I have always found that when people fight fiercely over an inheritance, the root cause is rarely the coin itself. It is usually a question of pride, or perhaps a secret that someone is desperate to keep locked away in the attic." Before Mrs. Bantry could press for further elaboration, a pursuit she found both baffling and perversely thrilling. A sharp, metallic crash echoed from the eastern wing of the manor, cutting through the muffled strains of the gramophone. It was the distinct sound of crystal shattering upon stone, followed immediately by a stifled gasp that was swallowed almost instantly by the rising wind. Several guests near the terrace doors paused, glasses suspended halfway to their lips, glancing around with mild irritation rather than alarm. Holiday parties at Downes House were notorious for clumsy footmen and fragile heirlooms, and Colonel Wainwright was known for his short temper regarding the household staff. Clumsy oaf, Colonel Wainwright barked aloud, his booming voice carrying easily over the chatter as he strode out from the drawing room, his florid face flushed with a mixture of festive port and irritation. He straightened his tweed waistcoat with a sharp tug. "I told that new boy, what's his name, Peters, not to stack the punch glasses near the library French windows. Always rushing, never looking where he's going. If he breaks that Venetian decanter, his wages won't cover the cork." Sir Reginald Croft chuckled, adjusting his spectacles. "Easy, Arthur. It's Christmas. Even the clumsy deserve a pardon today, eh?" "Not in my house," Wainwright muttered darkly, though he allowed himself to be steered back toward the roaring brazier by Lady Camilla, who smoothed down her emerald green silk dress with the practiced grace of a hostess deflecting a diplomatic crisis. Yet Miss Marple did not laugh. Her pale blue eyes remained fixed on the heavy oak door leading to the inner library corridor. The sound had not come from the pantry where the glassware was kept. It had come from the small alcove housing the historical family portraits, a secluded corridor that led directly to the Colonel's private study, where the estate's heavy iron safe remained bolted into the masonry. "A great pity," Miss Marple whispered softly to herself, her knitting needles pausing for a fraction of a second before resuming their steady, hypnotic rhythm. "Venetian crystal is remarkably resilient, unless, of course, it was dropped by someone whose hands were shaking." As the winter dusk began to bleed into a deep, bruised purple across the horizon, the garden party continued its frantic dance against the creeping cold. Laughter drifted across the terrace, festive lights blinked on along the hedgerows, and the villagers exchanged merry holiday greetings, entirely oblivious to the fact that the fragile veneer of St. Mary Mead had just been cracked down the middle. In the shadows of the conservatory, Miss Marple watched the guests mingle, noting who stood too close to the exits, who avoided eye contact with the Colonel, and whose smiles felt brittle as the winter frost. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and beneath the innocent facade of a village holiday gathering, the first silent pieces of a deadly puzzle had quietly fallen into their places. The festive lights of Downes House blinked merrily against the gathering gloom of the December evening, casting long, wavering ribbons of amber and crimson across the frost-crusted lawns. Inside the sprawling marquee, the murmur of polite conversation had begun to thin as guests drifted toward the warmth of the main drawing room, eager for the promised display of lantern slides and hot-spiced punch. Yet, despite the crackling fires and the cheerful strains of carols drifting from the gramophone, an intangible shift had settled over the gathering, a faint, uneasy friction that hummed just beneath the surface of village civility. Miss Jane Marple stood near the heavy velvet drapes of the library French windows, her slender fingers resting lightly upon the polished mahogany of a side table. She was watching Colonel Wainwright, who stood by the hearth with a glass of neat brandy in his hand, his broad shoulders stiff beneath his Harris tweed jacket. For a man hosting a holiday celebration, the Colonel looked remarkably like a commander awaiting an artillery barrage. His eyes kept darting toward the dark, wood-paneled hallway leading to his private study, and every time the grandfather clock in the corner chimed the quarter hour, his jaw tightened until the skin around his mouth whitened. "It is quite extraordinary, isn't it, Jane?" Mrs. Dolly Bantry whispered, materializing at Miss Marple's elbow with a delicate silver plate bearing half a mince pie. Mrs. Bantry's sharp gaze followed the Colonel's line of sight before settling on Julian Wainwright, who was leaning against the bookshelf near the conservatory entrance, nursing a gin and tonic with an expression of supreme studied indifference. "Arthur has been like a coiled spring all afternoon. And Julian, one would think he was attending a funeral rather than his uncle's Christmas fete. Do you know, young Dr. Haydock told me just now that he saw Julian lurking near the estate office yesterday afternoon, looking about as welcome as a bailiff at a christening." Dr. Haydock is a most observant man, Dolly, Miss Marple replied softly, her pale blue eyes fixed on the play of firelight across the Persian rug. Doctors, of course, see people at their most vulnerable, when their defenses are entirely stripped away. They learn to recognize the symptoms of internal distress long before the patient is willing to admit that anything is amiss. Distress? Nonsense, Jane. It's greed, Mrs. Bantry insisted, leaning in with a conspiratorial flutter of her eyelashes. Everyone in St. Mary Mead knows that Julian ran through his mother's inheritance at racecourses in Brighton and card rooms in Mayfair. When his father died, Arthur bailed him out twice. Twice, my dear, on the strict condition that the boy mend his ways and take up a respectable position in the city. But look at him now, back in the village, hands empty, hovering around the safe like a jackal sniffing at a carcass. If something valuable were to go missing from Down's house tonight, I wouldn't waste a second calling Scotland Yard. I'd point straight at Julian. Human nature is terribly complex, isn't it? Miss Marple murmured, her knitting needles tucked neatly into her velvet work-bag. We are so terribly quick to judge by appearances, the flashy tie, the mounting debts, the sullen expression, forgetting entirely that the most dangerous poison is often slipped into a cup that looks remarkably sweet and wholesome. A desperate man makes a great deal of noise, Dolly, but a truly calculating one works in absolute silence. Before Mrs. Bantry could ponder the philosophical weight of this observation, a sharp, sudden commotion erupted near the front entrance hall. The heavy oak front door flew open, letting in a bitter gust of wind that sent the paper decorations fluttering from the chandelier, accompanied by the frantic voice of young Peters, the footman. Colonel Wainwright, sir. You had better come outside at once, sir." The conversational hum in the drawing-room died instantly. Glasses paused halfway to mouths, heads snapped around in unison. Colonel Wainwright slammed his brandy glass down onto the mantelpiece with a resounding crack, liquor splashing over the polished wood. "What is the meaning of this, Peters?" Wainwright roared, striding out into the hallway with heavy, authoritative steps, his face dark with suppressed fury. "Can't a man have a moment's peace in his own home without staff panicking over a spilled tray?" "It's not a tray, sir," the footman stammered, his face pale as curd, his hands trembling violently as he clutched a heavy brass lantern. It's out by the rhododendron walk, near the old potting shed. Mrs. Vance asked me to check on the garden heaters because the draft blew them out, and I found something, sir, in the snow." A collective chill seemed to ripple through the assembled guests as they crowded into the hallway, peering past the colonel's broad shoulders. Sir Reginald Croft pushed his way to the front, his magistrate's instincts instantly kicking in. "Steady on, boy. What did you find?" It's a body, sir," Peters whispered, his voice cracking on the final syllable. "It's Mr. Henderson, and he's not moving." Panic, swift and electric, tore through the gathering. Mrs. Vance let out a sharp theatrical shriek that bordered on hysteria, clutching at Sir Reginald's sleeve for support, while Lady Camilla pressed a lace handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes widening in sheer disbelief. Julian Wainwright dropped his glass. It shattered upon the flagstones with a bright, crystalline ring that echoed ominously in the sudden silence. Colonel Wainwright shoved past the footman and bolted out into the freezing night air, followed by a surging wave of horrified onlookers. Miss Marple, however, did not rush. With a quiet, unhurried grace, she reached for her heavy woolen cape that hung over the mahogany coat rack, drew it snugly about her shoulders, and stepped out onto the frost-bitten terrace behind the surging crowd. Beneath the skeletal branches of the ancient rhododendron bushes, where the moonlight cut sharp and blue across the drifted snow, a grim tableau awaited them. Mr. Henderson, the ambitious young solicitor from the village, lay sprawled face down upon the frozen turf. His dark overcoat was dusted with a fine layer of fresh snow, and one outstretched hand clutched a silver-plated cigarette case that glinted dully in the pale light. But it was not the fall that had ended him. Protruding starkly from the center of his back was the ornate ivory-handled hilt of a heavy Persian dagger, a collector's piece that, only an hour before, had hung securely upon the library wall inside Down's house. Sir Reginald Croft dropped to one knee beside the fallen man, pressing two trembling fingers against Henderson's icy wrist before pulling them away with a grim, definitive shake of his head. "He's gone. the magistrate muttered, looking up at the horrified circle of faces with stunned disbelief. Killed instantly. And judging by the temperature of the body, he hasn't been out here more than 20 minutes. A chaotic storm of voices instantly erupted. Murder! Good God, in St. Mary Mead! Cried the Reverend Abbot, crossing himself with a shaking hand. It must have been a robbery. Look at his pockets! Shouted Mr. Calthorpe, peering down at the torn lining of Henderson's coat. Rubbish! Barked Colonel Wainwright, his face contorted with rage and mounting panic. Who carries a dagger out into a snowdrift? This was personal. The man was a scoundrel. He's been poking his nose into my estate accounts for weeks. Amidst the rising tide of accusations, panic, and fluttering theories, Miss Marple remained standing quietly at the edge of the snowbank. Her pale blue eyes swept over the scene, not merely at the tragic figure in the snow, but at the semicircle of terrified guests standing upon the terrace. She noted whose boots were caked with fresh, wet mud from the lower garden path, whose hands were trembling with genuine shock versus calculated fear, and whose eyes refused to look down at the fallen solicitor. Slowly, deliberately, Miss Marple reached down and gently adjusted the clasp of her cloak, her lips parting in a faint, melancholic sigh. How very tragic, she whispered to the freezing winter wind, her voice carrying an eerie, calm clarity through the commotion. And how remarkably foolish of the murderer to assume that a blanket of white snow would hide the very footprints they left behind. The heavy mahogany doors of Downe's house were bolted against the biting December wind, yet the chill that had crept into the manor was no longer meteorological. It had settled deep into the bones of every living soul within its walls. In the grand drawing room, where the roaring hearth usually provided a cozy sanctuary of holiday warmth, the atmosphere now resembled a courtroom awaiting the pronouncement of a sentence. The curtains had been drawn tight, shutting out the dark, frost-bitten expanse of the lawn where Mr. Henderson's lifeless form had so recently been carried away by the local constable and a pair of grim-faced assistants. Inspector Arthur Slack of the CID had arrived with all the subtlety of a collapsing scaffold, his damp trench coat shedding melted snow onto the priceless oriental rug, and his loud, abrasive voice grating against the tense silence of the room. Slack was a man who believed entirely in the loud, the obvious, and the immediate. To him, human nature was a simple mechanistic equation. Find the person with the largest motive, the bloodiest hands, and the weakest alibi. Clap the irons upon them, and let the courts sort out the finer philosophical points. Right then. Let's have it straight, and let's have it quick, Inspector Slack announced, standing squarely before the hearth with his thumbs hooked aggressively into his belt. He cast a sweeping, suspicious glare around the semicircle of pale faces. Colonel Wainwright, rigid and fuming, Lady Camilla, clutching her smelling salts, Mrs. Vance nervously twisting a diamond ring, and Julian staring down into an empty glass with sullen detachment. We've got a dead solicitor lying in the shrubbery with a Persian dagger between his shoulder blades. The weapon came off the library wall inside this very house. The doors were locked from the inside, meaning nobody from the village gatecrashers did it. That narrows our pool of charming house guests down to the family and friends currently enjoying the Colonel's hospitality. Now, who wants to tell me why young Mr. Henderson was out in the cold without his overcoat buttoned up? He wasn't out there by choice, you blundering idiot, Colonel Wainwright barked, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson as he surged forward from his armchair. The man was lured out, or dragged out. Henderson was a pest, yes, he had been auditing some discrepancies in the tenant leases, but that doesn't mean I ran him through with my own ancestral steel while hosting half the parish. Nobody said you did, Colonel. Not yet, anyway. Inspector Slack replied with a thin, grating smile that failed to reach his small, dark eyes. Though a temper like yours has landed hotter heads than yours in the dock before now. But let's look at the facts, shall we? Motive, opportunity, and means. The library is directly accessible from the main hall. The dagger was missing from its mounting by 4 o'clock, right around the time the glass was heard shattering. And who had the most to gain from Henderson's untimely demise? Slack turned his gaze slowly, triumphantly, toward the shadowy corner near the bookcase. What about you, Mr. Julian Wainwright? Your uncle's ledger shows you've been pressing Henderson for a hefty advance on your expected inheritance. an advance the solicitor flatly refused to grant you yesterday afternoon. Care to tell us where you were when the glass broke in the corridor? Julian raised his head slowly, a bitter, cynical smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. His eyes were bloodshot, and the distinct smell of scotch hung heavily around him. I was in the billiards room, Inspector, alone, drinking. If you care to check the felt on the table, you'll probably find I missed 3 easy shots because my hands were shaking from a hangover, not murder. Very convenient, Slack scoffed, pulling a small notebook from his pocket and scribbling furiously with a stubby pencil. An unverified alibi from a broke, dissolute nephew with mounting gaming debts. It's textbook, really. Boy asks for money, solicitor says no, boy loses his temper, pinches a dagger, and settles the account permanently in the snow. Case closed, I'd say. Oh, but Inspector Slack, surely it isn't quite as simple as all that. The gentle, high-pitched inquiry drifted across the room like a falling autumn leaf, completely disarming in its polite innocence. All heads turned toward the fireside armchair, where Miss Jane Marple sat quietly with her knitting basket resting neatly in her lap. Her pale blue eyes regarded the blustering police inspector with the mild, benevolent curiosity of a Sunday school teacher listening to an overzealous pupil misinterpret a parable. Slack blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. He had noticed the elderly lady sitting quietly in the corner throughout his interrogation, but in his professional arrogance, he had mentally filed her away as harmless village furniture, an irrelevant auntie who should have been packed off to bed with a hot water bottle hours ago. "Beg pardon, madam," Slack said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you say something? Only that human nature is so terribly untidy, isn't it?" Miss Marple murmured, her needles resuming their soft, rhythmic clack-clack as she worked a pale grey wool pearl stitch. "One can never simply package it into neat little boxes labelled motive and opportunity, much as one might wish to. It would save the police a great deal of trouble, of course, but people simply do not behave according to textbook rules. Take baking a cake, for instance. A novice baker might look at a recipe and assume that because the flour and the sugar are the most abundant ingredients, they must be the source of whatever strange bitter taste ruins the sponge. But the experienced cook knows that it is usually just a tiny, invisible pinch of something quite insignificant, slipped in by someone who smiled charmingly while the mixing bowl was unattended, that completely alters the flavor." Inspector Slack stared at her, his jaw slackening slightly before hardening into an expression of irritated impatience. "With all due respect, ma'am, this isn't a kitchen. This is a murder investigation. We have a dead man, a missing weapon from the library wall, and a suspect with a massive gambling debt and no alibi. That's not a pinch of anything, that's a sledgehammer." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked softly, not looking up from her knitting. "Mr. Julian is certainly very loud in his desperation, and people who make a great deal of noise are terribly reassuring to investigate because they draw all the light toward themselves. But I have always found, Inspector, that the people who are truly dangerous are the ones who stand quietly in the background, smiling politely, while everyone else is busy looking at the wrong door." Colonel Wainwright grunted in agreement, though he still glared at his nephew with deep suspicion, while Lady Camilla nervously adjusted her lace collar. Inspector Slack, however, merely puffed out his chest, dismissing the elderly spinster with an indulgent, dismissive wave of his hand. "Appreciate the village wisdom, I'm sure, ma'am," Slack said brusquely, turning his back on Miss Marple to address the room at large. "But I'll stick to solid evidence and straight lines. Mr. Julian Wainwright, I must ask you to accompany me down to the village station for further questioning. And as for the rest of you, I suggest you stay put. Nobody leaves Downs House tonight until I say so." As the burly inspector gripped Julian by the arm and marched him toward the heavy oak doors, the young man casting one defiant, helpless glare back at the room, the tension in the drawing room reached a suffocating pitch. Miss Marple watched them leave, her knitting resting idly in her lap. Her expression remained serene, yet within the quiet depths of her pale blue eyes, a sharp, analytical light burned bright and steady. The police had their man, the village had its scandal, and the stage was set for tragedy. Yet Miss Marple knew that the true villain was still walking freely among them, entirely confident that their hidden secret remained safely buried beneath the winter snow. The morning sun rose over St. Man. Mary Mead not with a cheerful golden luminescence, but as a pale, jaundiced smear behind a heavy shroud of low-hanging grey clouds. The overnight frost still clung tenaciously to the hedgerows and thatched roofs, hardening the muddy ruts of the village lanes into iron-cast ridges that crunched sharply beneath the tires of the local butcher's delivery van. Inside Downes' house, the oppressive silence of a household nursing a dark secret hung heavy in the air. Inspector Slack had returned to the village police station with his captive, leaving behind a grim atmosphere of suspicion and frayed nerves. In the quiet warmth of the morning room, where a modest coal fire struggled against the drafty perimeter of the large bay windows, Miss Jane Marple sat by the secretary desk with a pair of delicate tortoiseshell spectacles perched upon the bridge of her nose. Before her lay an object that Inspector Slack, in all his blustering efficiency, had entirely overlooked, not because it was hidden away in a dark vault, but precisely because it was so utterly commonplace that it had blended into the background of the Colonel's domestic routine. It was a thick, leather-bound accounts ledger, its spine scuffed and faded from years of handling, detailing the agricultural rents, tenant arrears, and estate expenditures of the Downes house property. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had insisted on staying at the manor rather than braving the frosty walk back to her own cottage while a murderer remained unmasked, hovered anxiously near the fireplace, clutching a porcelain teacup with both hands. Her eyes darted restlessly toward the heavy oak door every time a floorboard creaked in the corridor outside. "It is all simply dreadful, Jane," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she stared down into her lukewarm tea. Poor Julian locked away in that dreadful village cell, shouting his head off about a framed setup, while the village is absolutely buzzing with the most ghastly rumors. The butcher told the curate that Julian was seen gambling with East End thugs last month, and Mrs. Calthorpe is already writing a letter to the bishop expressing her deep concern over the moral decay of the parish. And yet you sit there turning the pages of an old account book as though we were ordering marrow-fat peas for the harvest supper. Account books, my dear Dolly, are far more revealing than any diary ever written, Miss Marple replied softly, her gentle voice devoid of any sign of haste. Her thin, blue-veined finger traced down a column of neat copperplate figures inscribed in black ink. A diary can be edited after the fact. A person can write down noble sentiments to deceive whoever might read them in the future. But figures? Numbers have a stubborn, unromantic honesty about them. They reveal where a man's anxieties truly lie, long before his tongue is willing to confess them. Bantry set her teacup down with a sharp clatter upon the marble mantelpiece and stepped closer to the desk, her curiosity finally overcoming her nervous dread. What on earth could an estate ledger tell us about poor Mr. Henderson's murder? The man was a solicitor, not a crop yield. His job was simply to make sure Arthur wasn't being cheated by the tenant farmers. Was it, I wonder? Miss Marple murmured, turning another heavy page. Her finger stopped abruptly halfway down a column dated late November, just 3 weeks prior to the fatal garden party. Look here, Dolly. See this entry regarding the timber sales from the lower copse. The figures balance out to the exact penny, perfectly neat and tidy, just as any competent auditor would expect. But notice the ink. Dolly leaned in, squinting over the top of her glasses at the ledger page. The ink? Well, it's black, isn't it? Like all the rest. Is it? Miss Marple tilted the page slightly toward the weak morning light filtering through the frost-etched window pane. If you look very closely, under a strong lens, you will see that the original entry, listing a payment of £400 received from the timber merchant, was neatly scraped away with a razor blade. Over that erased patch, a new figure of £200 was written in a slightly different hand, using a heavier, oil-based ink that took much longer to dry. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened in sudden, startled comprehension. Good heavens! Someone altered the accounts. You mean embezzlement? Embezzlement on a remarkably sophisticated scale, Miss Marple agreed, her voice remaining as calm and measured as a parish prayer. £400 from a timber sale is a substantial sum, but when multiplied across several tenant leases and grazing rights over the past 3 years, the missing amount would easily run into the thousands. Enough to ruin an estate like Downes House, and quite enough to send a dishonest man to prison for a very long time. And Henderson discovered it, Dolly gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in astonishment. He found out the books were cooked, and he tried to blackmail the person responsible. Precisely, Miss Marple said, closing the ledger with a soft, decisive thud. Mr. Henderson was not killed because of a sudden quarrel over family inheritances or village debts. He was killed because he sat in this very room yesterday afternoon, pointed his finger at that altered entry, and demanded a price for his silence that the real thief simply could not afford to pay. The shattered glass in the corridor, the missing Persian dagger, the clumsy framing of young Julian, all of it was nothing more than an elaborate smokescreen designed to make the police look everywhere except at the person holding the pen. Before Mrs. Bantry could demand to know who among the household possessed both the access to the ledger and the motive to commit cold-blooded murder. A sharp knock sounded at the morning-room door. Lady Camilla entered, her face pale and drawn, wrapped in a heavy cashmere shawl that failed to stop her shivering. She looked at the two women with a mixture of apprehension and exhausted defiance. "Inspector Slack is returning from the village," Lady Camilla announced stiffly, gripping the back of an armchair for support. "He says he has found enough circumstantial evidence to officially charge Julian with the murder. He's marching up the driveway right now with a warrant." Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, smoothing down the front of her dark wool dress with quiet dignity. Her pale blue eyes caught the light of the flickering coal fire, shining with a sharp, unyielding resolve. "Then it is high time, my dear Lady Camilla," Miss Marple said softly, stepping out from behind the desk, "that we disabuse the inspector of his charming little romance before an innocent boy pays the ultimate price for someone else's greed." The heavy oak doors of the Downs House library creaked open with an ominous groan, echoing through the cavernous hall just as Inspector Slack's heavy boots stamped across the flagstones. Behind him trailed a thoroughly miserable Julian Wainwright, his collar turned up against the chill, flanked by village constable Higgins, who looked distinctly uncomfortable performing the role of jailer in such opulent surroundings. "I tell you, Inspector, it's an outrage," Colonel Wainwright thundered, striding out of the drawing-room with his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles shone white as bone. "Dragging my nephew back here in broad daylight as if he were a common footpad. If you had an ounce of common sense, Slack, you'd be out combing the common for the real villain instead of trying to pin a murder on a boy whose only real crime is running up a few gambling chits in Mayfair." "Keep your shirt on, Colonel," Inspector Slack retorted, his face flushed with the stubborn pride of a man who hated nothing more than being questioned by amateur gentry. He tossed his damp Trilby hat onto a mahogany side table with a wet slap. "A man doesn't get locked up on a whim. We found a pawnbroker's ticket in Mr. Julian's lodgings in town, matching the description of a gold pocket watch missing from the dead solicitor's desk, and his fingerprints are all over the library window latch. The case is tighter than a drum. Now, if everyone will kindly clear the room." "Not quite yet, Inspector." A soft, melodious voice intervened from the threshold of the morning room. Miss Jane Marple stepped into the hallway, her silver hair catching the pale winter light, her small hands neatly folded over the dark wool of her skirt. Behind her, Mrs. Bantry hovered with an expression of nervous, high-strung anticipation, while Lady Camilla gripped her cashmere shawl as though it were a lifeline. Slack groaned openly, rolling his eyes toward the vaulted ceiling. "Oh, Lord. Not you again, ma'am. Look, I've got work to do. A murder investigation is serious police business, not a parish sewing circle. If you've got more kitchen metaphors about baking cakes, save them for the vicar." "I am quite finished with baking, Inspector, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her tone as smooth and unruffled as morning cream. "Though I have been spending a most instructive hour examining the household accounts in the Colonel's secretary desk. A fascinating document, really. It is amazing how much light a simple column of figures can shed on human behavior, especially when someone has gone to the trouble of scraping away £400 of timber revenue with a razor blade." Colonel Wainwright froze mid-stride, his florid face instantly draining of color. What did you say?" he stammered, his booming voice suddenly dropping an octave. "The ledger, Arthur," Miss Marple said gently, walking past the blustering inspector as though he were merely a piece of hallway furniture. She entered the library, gesturing for the others to follow. A very clever forgery, executed with a heavy oil-based ink that took quite a while to dry. Naturally, a brilliant young solicitor like Mr. Henderson, who was not only advising you on estate matters, Arthur, but also quietly auditing your tenant receipts, spotted the discrepancy almost immediately. Mrs. Vance, who had been sitting quietly by the unlit hearth in the corner of the library, let out a sharp, indrawn breath. Her fingers tightened around her embroidered handkerchief until the delicate lace began to tear. "This is absurd," Mrs. Vance protested, her voice pitched just a shade too high, a frantic tremor belying her attempt at haughty indignation. "What has an estate ledger to do with a brutal murder in the snow? Are you suggesting that Arthur embezzled from his own property?" "Not Arthur, my dear Evelyn." Miss Marple turned her pale blue eyes toward Mrs. Vance, her gaze unwavering and terrifyingly kind. "Arthur is a proud man, a military man, and remarkably hot-tempered, as we have all witnessed. But his faults lie entirely on the surface. He would roar like a lion over a broken decanter, but he lacks the cool, methodical patience required to alter columns of figures over a 3-year period. No, the person who kept the auxiliary books, the person who managed the social calendar, handled the correspondence, and had daily access to the study while the colonel was out inspecting the lower pastures, was someone much closer to home." Inspector Slack stared from Miss Marple to Mrs. Vance, his professional skepticism finally giving way to a creeping, dawning confusion. "Hold on a minute. Are you pointing the finger at Mrs. Vance? On what grounds? An ink spot in an old book?" "Not just an ink spot, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, stepping closer to the mahogany desk where a silver letter opener lay beside a blotter. "Yesterday afternoon, when the glass shattered in the corridor, everyone in the marquee assumed it was clumsy footman Peters dropping punch cups in the pantry. But the sound did not come from the pantry. It came from the portrait alcove leading directly to this study. Someone had dropped something fragile, perhaps a small glass inkwell or a decorative paperweight, while hastily trying to return the stolen Persian dagger to its mount after stabbing Mr. Henderson in the garden." "That's a lie," Mrs. Vance shrieked, springing to her feet, her composure completely shattering as she backed against the bookshelves. "You have no proof. It's all guesswork. An old woman sitting in a corner imagining romance where there is only tragedy." "Is it guesswork, Evelyn?" Miss Marple asked quietly, taking a small, neatly folded handkerchief from her pocket and unfolding it to reveal a fragment of emerald green silk thread, the exact shade of the sleeve lining of Mrs. Vance's winter coat. "I found this caught upon the rough brass bracket of the library dagger mount this morning. And more importantly, Mr. Henderson's pocket diary, which Inspector Slack has not yet had time to examine thoroughly, contains a very explicit memo written yesterday morning, confronted Mrs. V. regarding the missing timber funds. Unless she repays the £400 by evening, I shall be obliged to inform the magistrate." The silence in the library was absolute. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to hold its breath. Colonel Wainwright turned slowly, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal as he looked at the woman who had been his trusted confidant and estate secretary for over 5 years. "Evelyn, is that true? You?" Mrs. Vance's chest heaved violently. The brittle mask of village sophistication cracked entirely, revealing the desperate, cornered animal beneath. Her eyes darted toward the French windows as if contemplating a desperate flight into the snow. But Constable Higgins blocked the path. "He was going to ruin me," Evelyn screamed, her voice breaking into a harsh, ugly sob as she sank onto the edge of the leather armchair, burying her face in her hands. All those years managing this drafty, bankrupt estate for a pittance while Arthur buried his head in the sand. I only took what was owed to me, what I deserved for keeping this sinking ship afloat. And that smug little clerk thought he could trap me, thought he could hold my future in his palm like a bug. Inspector Slack stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, the realization crashing over him that the elderly spinster he had dismissed as a harmless nuisance had just solved a murder case in less than 24 hours using nothing more than knitting needles, an account book, and an unshakable understanding of the dark, tangled roots of human greed. The confession hung in the frigid air of the library like the acrid smoke of a burnt wick, leaving every occupant momentarily suspended in disbelief. Mrs. Vance sat collapsed in the leather armchair, her shoulders heaving with ragged, defeated sobs, her carefully cultivated aura of sophistication entirely stripped away. Constable Higgins shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other, his hand resting hesitantly near his holster, as though unsure whether a weeping woman required handcuffs or smelling salts. Inspector Slack, his professional pride thoroughly bruised yet undeniably impressed, stared at Miss Marple with a mixture of begrudging awe and lingering bewilderment. Yet, despite the sudden collapse of Mrs. Vance's composure, Miss Jane Marple did not relax her posture. Her pale blue eyes remained fixed upon the weeping woman with a quiet, penetrating intensity. Not with malice, but with the clinical precision of a botanist examining a blighted specimen. "It is a terribly sad thing, isn't it?" Miss Marple murmured softly, breaking the heavy silence as she stepped a fraction closer to the desk. When pride and desperation intertwine so tightly that a person convinces themselves their dishonesty is actually a form of justice. But human nature is remarkably consistent in that regard. We always find the most ingenious ways to forgive our own transgressions, long before anyone else ever discovers them. Inspector Slack shook his head, clearing the fog of astonishment from his mind, and snapped his notebook open with a crisp slap. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, pulling a pair of steel cuffs from his pocket. "Got it in one, ma'am. Motive, opportunity, and now a full confession on the floor. I'll call the wagon from the village station and get her booked straight away for the murder of Arthur Henderson." "Wait, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping to a low, cautionary register that instantly arrested Slack's hand. The inspector blinked, glancing down at her in surprise. "Wait? What do you mean, wait?" "She just admitted to embezzling the funds and killing the solicitor." "She admitted to the embezzlement, yes," Miss Marple replied calmly, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Vance's bowed head. "And she admitted to feeling the crushing weight of his blackmail. But listen very closely to the rhythm of her distress, Inspector. When a guilty person breaks down under interrogation, their confession is always an avalanche. Everything comes pouring out at once, unbidden and unfiltered, because the burden of concealment has become too great to bear." Mrs. Vance's sobbing hitched. Through her fingers, one dark, terrified eye darted upward toward Miss Marple, a sudden, cold flash of panic cutting through her tears. "However," Miss Marple continued, her voice as gentle as falling snow, "there is a curious dissonance in Evelyn's confession. She spoke of the ledger, she spoke of the blackmail, and she spoke of the desperate fear of ruin. But notice what she did not mention. She never once explained how she managed to lure Mr. Henderson out into the freezing rhododendron walk without anyone noticing, nor how she possessed the physical strength to drive a heavy Persian dagger deep between his shoulder blades through a thick winter overcoat, a feat requiring a degree of cold-blooded leverage that scarcely matches the actions of a frantic woman dropping an inkwell in the corridor. A dead, suffocating silence descended upon the library once more. Colonel Wainwright stared at Miss Marple, his jaw dropping in sheer incomprehension. "What are you saying, Jane? Are you telling me Evelyn didn't kill him?" Mrs. Vance slowly lowered her hands from her face. Her skin was ghastly pale, her lipstick smeared, but the frantic, hunted look in her eyes had suddenly shifted into something sharp, cold, and calculating. She looked at Miss Marple not with despair, but with a chilling, predatory realization. "You don't know, do you?" Mrs. Vance whispered, her voice losing its ragged tearfulness and hardening into a bitter, venomous hiss. "You old vulture, you suspected the embezzlement. Anyone with half an eye on the books could have figured that out, and you used my panic to draw all the lightning away from the real storm." Inspector Slack stumbled backward a step, his face flushing crimson with professional indignation. "Hold on, are you saying there's another killer in my parish?" Miss Marple turned slowly to face the rest of the room, her knitting bag resting securely on her arm. "Human nature, Inspector, is layered like an old willow tree. When you peel back the rotten bark of financial fraud, you occasionally find that someone else has bored right through the heartwood, while everyone was busy watching the surface." Before Inspector Slack could demand an explanation, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the tense atmosphere from the hallway outside. It was the distinct click of the heavy front door latch, followed immediately by the rapid, echoing tread of footsteps marching toward the library. Julian Wainwright, who had been standing quietly by the door under the constable's supervision, suddenly stiffened. His face drained of color as the library door swung open wide, revealing the tall, imposing figure of solicitor's clerk Thomas Miller, a man who had supposedly been dispatched back to the London office the previous evening. Miller stood in the doorway, his overcoat dusted with fresh snow, holding a heavy leather briefcase in one hand. But it was not his presence that froze the blood in the room. It was the gleaming silver-plated pocket watch hanging loosely from his fingers, the very watch belonging to the murdered Arthur Henderson, which the police had supposedly recovered from Julian's town lodgings. "It seems, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, her pale blue eyes shining with quiet triumph as she looked directly at the newcomer, "that you were entirely correct about one thing yesterday. The case was indeed as tight as a drum, but the person who placed the pawn ticket in poor Mr. Julian's lodgings wasn't the broken aristocrat trying to escape his debts. It was the man who needed to ensure that the police closed their books before anyone bothered to check who actually inherited Mr. Henderson's private trust accounts." Thomas Miller's hand tightened instinctively around the leather briefcase, his mouth twisting into a cold, dangerous smile as the trap finally snapped shut around him in the heart of St. Mary Mead. The heavy silence in the library was broken only by the rhythmic, muffled ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, measuring out seconds that felt like hours. Thomas Miller stood framed in the doorway, his tall frame rigid against the pale winter light filtering through the high-arched windows. For a fraction of a second, the mask of deferential clerical efficiency slipped entirely from his features, revealing the hardened, calculating expression of a man who realized he had miscalculated his adversary. Inspector Slack stared at the clerk, his jaw working silently as his mind scrambled to reassemble the shattered pieces of his premature conclusion. "Miller," the inspector finally exploded, taking a heavy step forward with his hand instinctively reaching for his handcuffs. "What the hell do you think you're playing at? You were supposed to be halfway back to London by the 5 o'clock express yesterday." "London can wait, Inspector," Miss Marple interposed gently, her voice cutting through the rising tide of confusion with the quiet authority of a church bell tolling across the village green. She did not raise her voice, yet every eye in the room snapped back to her. Mr. Miller had far more pressing matters to attend to here in St. Mary Mead. After all, when an accomplice panics and confesses to embezzlement under pressure, one must ensure that the blame is securely fastened where it can do the least damage to the real mastermind. Thomas Miller's lips curled into a thin, brittle smile, though his eyes remained as cold and flat as winter pebbles. He shifted his weight slightly, his fingers tightening over the leather briefcase. "You're an imaginative old woman, Mrs. Marple. I'll give you that much. A nice, cozy village fairy tale about crooked books and hidden daggers. But imagination isn't evidence." Inspector Slack searched Mr. Julian's lodgings and found the pawnbroker's ticket for the dead man's watch. "That's a matter of police record, not village gossip." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked, tilting her head with mild, almost maternal curiosity. Her knitting needles clicked softly inside her velvet bag. Inspector Slack found the ticket, yes, but did he check when that ticket was actually printed? Or who was seen loitering in the boarding house hallway on Tuesday afternoon while Mr. Julian was out at the post office? Inspector Slack's face darkened from a florid pink to a dangerous crimson. He wheeled around to face the clerk, his professional pride stung to the quick. "Well, Miller, care to explain how the dead man's pocket watch ended up in your coat pocket when my sergeant searched your bag at the station this morning? Or why you conveniently returned to Downs' house just as things were falling apart?" Before Miller could formulate a reply, Miss Marple raised a small, perfectly manicured hand. "There is no need for him to explain, Inspector. Human nature follows such predictable patterns when the net begins to tighten. Mr. Miller fancied himself quite the financial strategist. He realized months ago that poor Mr. Henderson was not merely auditing the estate accounts for Colonel Wainwright, but was quietly investigating the private investment fund managed out of the London office. Funds that Mr. Miller had been systematically draining to finance his own ambitious tastes in the city. Colonel Wainwright stepped forward, his fists clenched, his face purple with outrage. You were handling my London portfolio. I trusted you with the family's reserve capital." "Trust, my dear Colonel, is such a fragile commodity," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes resting briefly on the Colonel before returning to the clerk. "When Mr. Henderson discovered the discrepancy in the London accounts and threatened to expose the entire fraud during his visit here yesterday, Mr. Miller knew his career, and quite possibly his freedom, was at an end. He followed the solicitor out to the terrace during the garden party, slipped the Persian dagger from the library wall while everyone was distracted by the festive music, and struck Henderson down in the snow. "That's insane," Miller snapped, his voice finally cracking, the thin veneer of professional calm giving way to raw panic. "I was in the village inn all afternoon. I have receipts." "Receipts, Mr. Miller, are easily obtained when one pays the innkeeper in advance," Miss Marple replied smoothly. "Just as a pawnbroker's ticket is easily slipped into a young man's coat when one has access to his lodgings. But you made one fatal mistake, the sort of mistake that only someone who views human beings as mere numbers on a balance sheet would ever make." Miller sneered, though a bead of cold sweat now trickled down his temple. "And what mistake was that?" "You underestimated the power of vanity," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "When you stole Mr. Henderson's silver pocket watch to incriminate Mr. Julian, you forgot that the watch had a custom monogram engraved on the inner case by a jeweler in Brighton, the very jeweler who repaired it for Mr. Henderson last month. And when Inspector Slack checks the registry, he will find that the watch was pawned not by Mr. Julian, but by a tall gentleman wearing a woolen scarf identical to the one you left hanging in the front hallway." For a long, agonizing moment, the room hung suspended in absolute stillness. Thomas Miller's eyes darted toward the French windows, calculating the distance to the snowy terrace, measuring the chances of a desperate flight across the frozen lawns of St. Mary Mead. His muscles tensed, his shoulders hunching like a sprinter waiting for the starter's pistol. Inspector Slack, finally catching the rhythm of the game, didn't wait for hesitation. With a roar of triumph that shook the ancient rafters, the burly inspector lunged forward, tackling the clerk squarely across the mahogany library table. The heavy briefcase flew from Miller's grip, scattering legal documents across the Persian rug as Constable Higgins rushed in to snap the steel handcuffs firmly around the clerk's wrists. As the frantic struggle subsided into the heavy, ragged breathing of the captured man, Colonel Wainwright sank heavily into a leather armchair, burying his face in his trembling hands. Mrs. Vance sat motionless by the unlit hearth, staring blankly at the floor as the full weight of her own narrow escape settled over her. Miss Jane Marple stood quietly beside the bookshelf, her knitting needles resuming their steady, hypnotic rhythm. Clack, 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 clack. A quiet testament to the enduring reality that beneath the polished veneer of polite society, human nature remained endlessly, fascinatingly flawed. The commotion in the library had finally subsided into a heavy, exhausted silence, broken only by the crackle of a fresh log catching fire in the hearth and the occasional jingle of Constable Higgins' brass buttons as he secured the cuffs around Thomas Miller's wrists. The clerk stood defeated, his hair disheveled and his fine city suit smudged with dust from the mahogany table, glaring down at the Persian rug with sullen, impotent fury. Inspector Slack stood beside him, chest heaving with the residual adrenaline of the tussle, wearing the proud, slightly flushed expression of a man who had successfully wrestled a tiger, even if someone else had practically handed him the leash. In the center of the room, surrounded by the tense, expectant faces of the household, Miss Jane Marple stood with quiet dignity. She had returned her knitting to its velvet bag, though her hands rested upon it with the poised, gentle serenity of a retired schoolmistress presiding over a parish committee meeting. "Well, I'll be blessed," Inspector Slack muttered, running a hand across his forehead and shaking his head as he looked from the subdued clerk to the elderly spinster. "I've seen some rum do's in my time on the force, ma'am, but I have to hand it to you. You walked right through a nest of vipers, sorted out the embezzlement from the murder, and pinned the right man without ever raising your voice above a polite parish whisper. How on earth did you piece it all together so precisely?" Miss Marple offered a small, self-deprecating smile, her pale blue eyes twinkling with mild amusement. "It is really not a matter of police genius, Inspector, but merely a lifetime of observing human nature in a very small village. St. Mary Mead is, in its own quiet way, a microcosm of the entire world. People think that because villages are peaceful and green, everyone behaves like characters in a Sunday sermon. But human passions, greed, fear, vanity and malice, are precisely the same whether you live in a grand London townhouse or a thatched cottage by the common. But Miller, how did you know it wasn't poor Julian or even Mrs. Vance who struck the fatal blow?" Colonel Wainwright asked hoarsely, raising his head from his hands. The old soldier looked 10 years older than he had 24 hours ago, the festive bluster completely drained from his broad frame. Evelyn confessed to cooking the books, and God knows I'll never forgive myself for not seeing through that. But why would Miller kill Henderson? Because, my dear Colonel, financial fraud is very much like a house built upon shifting sand, Miss Marple explained, stepping gracefully toward the center of the Persian rug. When a man like Mr. Henderson, thorough, clever, and relentlessly ambitious, begins to poke around in the ledgers, he doesn't just find a single altered entry. He finds the entire foundation is rotten. Mrs. Vance was skimming from the local timber receipts to pay off personal debts. Yes, that was her small, desperate folly. But Mr. Miller was managing the larger corporate investments out of the London office, where the sums were exponentially larger and the paper trail far more complex. She paused, casting a calm, steady gaze toward the handcuffed clerk, who refused to meet her eyes. When Mr. Henderson discovered the discrepancy during his audit yesterday afternoon, he didn't just threaten Mrs. Vance. He confronted Miller as well, realizing that the discrepancy spanned both the estate accounts and the central trust. Mrs. Vance's panic was loud and messy, which made her an easy target for suspicion. But Miller was cold, calculating, and patient. He realized that if he could murder the solicitor, steal the Persian dagger from the library wall during the garden party commotion, and expertly plant the evidence, including the forged pawnbroker's ticket, upon young Julian, 2 birds would fall with a single stone. Julian would take the blame for the murder, Mrs. Vance would take the blame for the embezzlement, and Miller would walk away untouched with the embezzled trust funds safely tucked into his pockets. "And the watch?" Slack asked, his professional curiosity fully reawakened. "The pocket watch you mentioned, the one with the Brighton jeweler's mark." "Ah, the watch was Miller's undoing," Miss Marple said with a gentle nod. "A truly clever criminal always relies on logic, but they invariably overlook sentiment. When Miller stole the watch from Henderson's coat pocket after the murder, he intended to drop it into Julian's lodgings, but he didn't realize that Mr. Henderson had only just retrieved that watch from being repaired the previous week, and the jeweler keeps a meticulous registry of every serial number. Furthermore, a man accustomed to the pristine cleanliness of a city office leaves traces of his habits behind, such as a distinctive brand of Turkish cigarettes smoked only in the private alcoves of the London Railway Club, ash of which I found trapped in the lining of the dead man's overcoat, where Miller had brushed against him during the struggle. A murmur of sheer astonishment rippled through the room. Lady Camilla, who had remained silently gripping her cashmere shawl near the doorway, let out a long, shuddering sigh of profound relief, while Dolly Bantry, who had slipped back into the library just in time to catch the climax, clasped her hands together in ecstatic triumph. "Brilliant, Jane. Absolutely breathtaking," Mrs. Bantry declared, forgetting all appropriate solemnity in her excitement. "It's just like reading one of Mr. Christie's thrilling stories, only better because it actually happened right here in St. Mary Mead." "Life is rarely a storybook, my dear Dolly," Miss Marple replied softly, her expression turning momentarily pensive as her gaze drifted toward the frost-etched window pane, beyond which the pale winter sun was beginning its slow, bruised descent toward the horizon. "Stories have neat endings where everyone learns their lesson and walks away into the sunset. In real life, the scars remain long after the bandages are removed." Inspector Slack cleared his throat, suddenly shifting from awe back to official duty as he gripped Miller's arm. "Well, ma'am, I've got a prisoner to transport down to the village lockup and a great deal of paperwork to explain to the superintendent in Scotland Yard. I dare say they won't believe half of it without your notes, but we'll manage." He tipped his hat toward Miss Marple with a rare, genuine gesture of respect. "If you ever decide to hang up your knitting and join the CID, let me know. We could use a sharper eye than half the inspectors on the payroll." "Thank you, Inspector, but I am entirely too fond of my garden," Miss Marple replied with a faint, polite smile. With a sharp tug, Slack hauled the unresisting clerk toward the heavy oak doors, Constable Higgins following closely behind. As the heavy portal swung shut behind them, sealing off the drama of the arrest, a profound, heavy quiet settled once more over the library of Downes House. The storm had passed, the dark secrets had been dragged from the snow into the harsh light of day, and justice had been served. Not by brute force or forensic science, but by the quiet, unyielding patience of an elderly woman who understood that beneath all our polite manners and festive gatherings, human nature remained endlessly, fascinatingly complex. The winter gale that had battered the thatched roofs and frost-crusted hedgerows of St. Mary Mead finally spent its fury overnight, leaving behind a pristine, blinding blanket of snow that stretched unbroken across the rolling common and the sloping lawns of Downs House. By Sunday morning, the village steeple rose sharp and black against a pale, washed blue sky, its bells tolling out across the frozen meadows for morning service, with a clear, resonant chime that seemed almost defiant in its normality. Inside her cozy cottage at the end of the lane, Miss Jane Marple stood by the bay window, a small porcelain teacup resting delicately in her saucer as she watched a pair of robins hop across the snow-covered top of her garden wall in search of crumbs. The frantic panic of the Christmas garden party, the flashing lights of police cars, the weeping confessions in the wood-paneled library, and the grim discovery beneath the rhododendrons now felt like a distant, troubled dream belonging to another season entirely. Yet, as Miss Marple knew all too well, the footprint of human nature never truly washed away. It merely waited for the next thaw to reveal what lay buried beneath the surface. The front gate clicked softly, and a moment later, a familiar, brisk knock sounded upon the cottage door. It was Mrs. Dolly Bantry, wrapped in an enormous silver fox fur stole that made her look rather like a benevolent, overly dramatic bear, stamping the melting snow from her galoshes onto the porch mat. "Jane, are you decent, my dear?" Dolly called out, pushing open the parlor door without waiting for an invitation, her cheeks whipped bright crimson by the crisp morning air. She swept into the room, bringing with her the bracing chill of the outdoors and an unmistakable aura of eager, unflagging village gossip. "The whole parish is absolutely beside itself this morning. The butcher told the curate that Thomas Miller has already confessed to embezzling half the trust funds before they even reached the county jail, and poor Julian Wainwright was released from custody late last night with a full, groaning apology from Inspector Slack. Can you imagine? The boy actually came over to the vicarage this morning looking quite respectable in a tweed suit, offering to help Mrs. Calthorpe arrange the carol singing." Miss Marple turned from the window, her pale blue eyes warm and amused as she gestured toward the comfortable fireside armchair. "That is very good news indeed, Dolly. Julian is a young man of considerable spirit, and everyone deserves a second chance when the true weight of their youthful mistakes is lifted from their shoulders." "Second chance, indeed," Mrs. Bantry declared, sinking into the armchair with a contented sigh as she accepted a cup of freshly brewed Darjeeling tea. "Though what will become of poor Lady Camilla and the Colonel is anyone's guess. Downs House is practically bankrupt after years of Evelyn's quiet skimming and Miller's grand London manipulations. They'll have to sell off the lower pasture and perhaps even part of the library collection just to pay the tenant arrears. It just goes to show, Jane, you simply never know what is festering behind a grand facade until someone lifts the floorboards. People are remarkably good at projecting an image of stability when their world is crumbling around them, my dear," Miss Marple agreed softly, resuming her seat in the opposite chair and taking up her knitting needles. The familiar, comforting clack-clack began its steady rhythm once more. "We like to think that wealth and social standing act as a shield against human weakness, but the truth is quite the opposite. The higher the wall, the more desperate the secrets hidden within the garden. And to think it all unraveled because of an ink spot and an old pocket watch," Dolly exclaimed, shaking her head in genuine wonder. "Slack is still strutting around the village pub as though he solved the entire puzzle single-handedly, though even he had the grace to admit to the magistrate that your observations were, well, remarkably astute for an amateur." "Inspector Slack is a very energetic and well-meaning officer," Miss Marple murmured mildly, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "And policemen are terribly fond of concrete evidence. Fingerprints, footprints, pawnbroker tickets. They need something they can hold in their hands before they can believe in a motive. But human nature, Dolly, is not written in ink upon a ledger. It is written in the small, seemingly insignificant habits of daily life. The way someone avoids eye contact during tea, the nervous flutter of a handkerchief, or an uncharacteristic slip of the tongue when the conversation turns uncomfortably close to the truth. Well, whatever it was, St. "Mary Mead owes you a debt of gratitude," Mrs. Bantry said, leaning back and gazing affectionately at her friend. "Though I shudder to think what would have happened if you hadn't been sitting quietly behind that fern in the conservatory when the first snow began to fall." "Oh, I should think everything would have worked out eventually, Dolly," Miss Marple replied with characteristic modesty, her needles flashing silver in the winter light. "Truth has a stubborn habit of coming to the surface, much like the bulbs we plant in autumn. No matter how deeply winter buries them beneath the frost and snow, spring always arrives, and everything hidden in the dark eventually reaches upward toward the light." Outside, across the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, the church bells fell silent, leaving only the tranquil hush of the snow-laden countryside. The village had returned to its peaceful, orderly rhythm, its inhabitants walking beneath the skeletal boughs of the winter trees, entirely unaware of the dark currents that flowed just beneath the surface of their daily lives. Yet inside the cottage, as the fire crackled warmly and the knitting needles clicked in steady harmony, Miss Jane Marple continued her silent, timeless observation of the human heart. Ever watchful, ever gentle, and forever wise. The iron grip of winter did not release St. Mary Mead all at once. Rather, it yielded in slow, grudging stages as February gave way to the soft, damp breezes of March. Across the common, the pale yellow bobbing heads of wild daffodils began to push their way through the thawing mud, and the heavy frost that had crusted the windows of Downe's house melted into steady, weeping streams of moisture. Life in the village resumed its familiar, unhurried cadence, though the shadow of the Christmas tragedy lingered quietly in the background, like an uninvited guest who had left his hat in the hallway. In the vicarage garden, Miss Jane Marple stood beside the brick pathway, with a pair of pruning shears in her leather-gloved hands, methodically cutting back the dead, brittle canes of last year's rose bushes. The morning sun was warm enough to coax a gentle steam from the dark earth, and the air was filled with the sweet, earthy scent of damp mulch and the sharp tang of freshly turned soil. Beside her on a wooden garden stool rested a woven trug filled with garden twine and plant labels, alongside a half-finished baby's cardigan in soft lemon wool. The garden gate swung open with a familiar, cheerful squeak, and Mrs. Dolly Bantry appeared, striding down the gravel path with her boots clicking briskly against the stones. Dolly looked remarkably sprightly, draped in a light tweed coat with a cheerful yellow scarf knotted around her neck, carrying a small brown paper parcel tied with string. "Morning, Jane," Dolly called out, waving the parcel triumphantly as she approached. "I intercepted the postman at the bottom of the lane. There's a letter for you from your nephew Raymond in London, but more importantly, you'll never guess who has just arrived at the rectory to stay with Mr. and Mrs. Calthorpe." Miss Marple paused in her work, snipping off a final thorny stem before resting her shears in the trug. She wiped her hands on a small cotton cloth tucked into her apron pocket and offered her friend a calm, inquiring smile. "Good morning, Dolly. Raymond writes that his latest book of poetry is being well received by the critics, though I suspect he is spending far too much time dining out in Mayfair. As for the rectory, let me see. Given that Mrs. Calthorpe mentioned at the sewing circle last week that her niece Beatrice was suffering from a rather delicate chest cough brought on by the London fogs, I should imagine it is Beatrice who has come down to take the country air." Dolly stopped dead in her tracks, her jaw dropping with comical dismay. "Honestly, Jane, it is positively uncanny. How on earth do you manage it? You haven't left the lane since Tuesday, and yet you know who is visiting the parish before the guest has even unpacked her hat box." "It isn't uncanny at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied mildly, picking up her pruning shears and leading the way toward the wooden garden bench beneath the old apple tree. "Human nature is remarkably consistent in its domestic logistics. When a young lady in London develops a persistent winter cough, her mother naturally writes to the nearest country relative with a spare bedroom and clean air. And since Mrs. Calthorpe is the only one in the parish with both a spare room and a surplus of homemade blackberry jam for chest complaints, the conclusion writes itself. Well, Beatrice is here, and she is bringing quite a flurry of excitement with her," Dolly said, settling herself onto the wooden bench and untying her scarf. "She brings all the latest gossip from town about the trial. Apparently, Thomas Miller's defense counsel is trying to argue that the embezzlement was merely a clerical error and that the murder charge should be separated from the financial fraud. But everyone in legal circles knows the evidence is airtight. The jeweler's testimony regarding the pocket watch alone is enough to send him down for 20 years. Justice, when it is truly grounded in facts, has a way of being very thorough, Miss Marple observed quietly, sitting down beside her friend and picking up her knitting needles. The pale lemon wool began to dance between her fingers with a familiar, hypnotic rhythm. Though I cannot help feeling a quiet sorrow for Miller's elderly mother living down in Sussex. People so rarely consider the collateral damage that ripples outward when someone gives in to greed. A crime is never just an isolated act between the perpetrator and the victim. It is a stone dropped into a quiet pool, sending dark circles touching lives that had no part in the original wrongdoing. Speaking of ripples, Dolly lowered her voice, leaning in closer as she adjusted her spectacles. Have you heard about Julian Wainwright? He's taken a permanent position at the county agricultural office in the market town, and he's been calling on Colonel Wainwright every single Sunday without fail. The colonel told the rector yesterday, with tears in his eyes, my dear, actual tears, that he never realized what a fine young man his nephew was until they faced ruin together. They're even planning to replant the South Orchard next month. Adversity has a remarkable clarifying effect on family relationships, does it not? Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly in the spring air. When the grand illusion of wealth and status is stripped away, people are finally forced to look at one another not as heirs or estate managers, but simply as human beings who need one another to survive the winter. And Downs House itself, Dolly asked. Evelyn Vance has already packed her trunks and gone to live with a sister in Cheltenham, leaving the colonel to sort through the remaining ledgers with a proper auditor from the bank. Evelyn will do quite well in Cheltenham, Miss Marple remarked, her pale blue eyes drifting across the garden toward the church spire rising above the hedgerow. She has considerable organizational talents, even if she applied them to the wrong columns. Perhaps she will find a more honest outlet for her administrative skills, perhaps managing a charity bazaar or overseeing a church committee. People rarely change their fundamental nature, Dolly, but they can often be persuaded to channel their energies into safer, more socially constructive directions. For a few moments, the two friends sat in companionable silence, listening to the energetic chirping of sparrows in the apple branches and the distant, rhythmic hum of a tractor working a field on the far side of the common. The village of St. Mary Mead was whole again, its routines restored, its gardens greening beneath the March sun. Yet Miss Marple knew, with the quiet certainty of long experience, that peace was never a permanent state. It was merely a delicate, hard-won truce between the orderly rules of society and the wild, unpredictable currents of the human heart. Well, Dolly sighed, standing up and brushing a stray bit of dried leaf from her tweed coat. I must run along. Beatrice is bringing out her watercolor sketch pad after lunch, and if I don't pretend to be deeply interested in her perspective of the village pond, she'll spend the entire afternoon complaining about the dampness of Sussex chimneys. Will you be coming down to the parish hall on Thursday for the committee meeting? I wouldn't miss it for the world, my dear, Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile, her fingers never pausing in their work. Mrs. Price Ridley is bringing her home-baked walnut cake, and as we both know, committee meetings are always vastly more entertaining when accompanied by a moderately disastrous pastry. Dolly laughed, waved a cheerful goodbye, and tripped lightly down the garden path, the gate clicking shut behind her with a bright, cheerful sound. Miss Marple watched her go until her yellow scarf vanished around the bend of the lane. Then, turning back to her knitting, she took a quiet, contented breath of the spring air, knowing that whatever new secrets, small scandals, or human follies tomorrow might bring to the peaceful lanes of St. Mary Mead, she would be sitting quietly in her corner, watching, listening and understanding it all. The soft amber light of an April afternoon filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage parlor, casting delicate, geometric shadows across the polished oak floorboards. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead was fully draped in the vibrant, cheerful greens of spring. Hawthorn blossoms frosted the hedgerows like spilled sugar, and the air was rich with the scent of damp earth, newly cut grass, and the sweet, heavy perfume of lilac blooming beside the porch. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed armchair by the bay window, wearing a neat lavender cardigan over her dark silk dress. On her lap rested the completed baby's cardigan in soft lemon wool, the tiny pearl buttons sewn on with absolute, meticulous perfection. Beside her on the small mahogany side table sat a delicate bone china teacup and a silver letter opener, alongside Raymond's letter from London, which she had already read twice with a quiet, maternal amusement at her nephew's poetic exaggerations. The front gate clicked softly, followed by the light, hurried steps of a visitor coming up the gravel path. A moment later, a gentle knock sounded at the door, and before Miss Marple could rise, the door swung open to reveal Inspector Slack. The inspector looked uncharacteristically subdued. He was still wearing his heavy wool suit, though he had discarded his usual trench coat, and his rugged, weather-beaten face bore the faint, weary lines of a man who had spent the better part of a month swimming upstream against paperwork and Crown Prosecutor briefs. He stood awkwardly in the doorway for a second, holding his Trilby hat in both hands, before clearing his throat. "Ah, afternoon, ma'am," Slack said, his voice lacking its usual blustering boom, replaced by a tone of cautious, almost respectful deference. "Hope I'm not intruding on your afternoon peace." "Not at all, Inspector. Do come in and sit down," Miss Marple replied warmly, gesturing toward the fireside chair with a gracious inclination of her head. "It is always a pleasure to welcome visitors who bring news from the wider world. May I offer you a cup of tea? I have just brewed a fresh pot of Earl Grey, and there are some shortbread biscuits in the tin on the sideboard." Slack blinked, clearly touched by the hospitality, and took a seat on the edge of the velvet armchair, gingerly placing his hat on his knee. "Well, thank you, ma'am. Just a spot of tea, if it's no trouble. It's been a rather long train ride down from town, and to be quite frank, my head is still spinning." Miss Marple poured the tea with steady, practiced grace, sliding the cup across the small table toward him, before resuming her seat. "The trial has concluded, I take it? Wrapped up this morning at the Old Bailey," Slack sighed, taking a grateful sip of the hot tea. "Miller tried every legal trick in the book. His defense counsel argued right down to the wire that the financial discrepancies were merely bookkeeping errors, and that the murder was committed by an unknown vagrant who happened upon the terrace. But the Crown's case was airtight. Between the jeweler's testimony identifying the engraved pocket watch, the Turkish cigarette ash found in the overcoat lining, and the paper trail linking the missing London trust funds directly to his personal accounts, the jury didn't even take an hour to deliberate." "And the verdict?" Miss Marple asked quietly, her pale blue eyes serene. "Guilty on both counts. Judge didn't spare the rod either," Slack said, shaking his head slowly as he stared into the amber depths of his teacup. "He's going away for a very long time. 25 years minimum before he's even eligible to sniff parole. And as for Mrs. Vance, well, she turned King's evidence regarding the estate skimming and received a suspended sentence on the condition she make full restitution and perform community service up in Cheltenham. The Colonel is already trying to settle the remaining tenant debts by selling off some unproductive timber acreage, so Downes House will survive, battered though it may be." "That is a just outcome, Inspector," Miss Marple murmured, picking up her knitting needles to idly smooth a stray thread of wool. "Human justice is never perfect, of course, because we are all so terribly flawed and short-sighted in our judgments. But when the truth is finally brought to light, it clears the air like a spring thunderstorm. Everything feels so much lighter afterward." Slack looked across the small table at the elderly spinster, his expression a mixture of profound wonder and lingering bewilderment. He had spent his entire career believing that crime was solved by boot leather, fingerprints, magnifying glasses, and aggressive interrogation under harsh lamps. Yet here, in a quiet country parlor filled with the scent of lavender and tea, a gentlewoman with knitting needles had seen right through a murder plot that had baffled Scotland Yard's finest minds for days. "You know, ma'am," Slack said slowly, turning his hat over in his large calloused hands, "when I first met you down at Downes House, I thought you were just an interfering old busybody who belonged in a sewing circle rather than a murder investigation. I'm man enough to admit I was dead wrong. How on earth did you see through Miller's setup when everyone else was staring right at young Julian? Miss Marple offered a gentle, forgiving smile, her eyes twinkling with mild humor. It isn't a matter of cleverness, Inspector, I assure you. It is simply a matter of understanding human nature. When you have lived in St. Mary Mead for as many decades as I have, you come to realize that people rarely invent entirely new behaviors when they are under pressure. They simply exaggerate the faults they have carried with them all their lives. A dishonest man will always try to shift his burden onto the shoulders of someone already weak or unpopular, because cowardice is the natural companion of greed. Mr. Miller was clever with numbers, but he was fundamentally a coward. And cowards always leave traces because they are in too much of a hurry to cover their tracks properly. Slack nodded thoughtfully, taking another sip of tea before setting the cup down. He rose from his chair, picking up his hat and smoothing the brim with an air of quiet finality. Well, I must be heading back to the station before the evening express pulls out. The superintendent wants a full written report on how the case was cracked, and frankly, man, I'm going to have a devil of a time explaining how a village knitting basket solved a murder that nearly threw the county into panic. Just tell the superintendent that human nature is remarkably consistent, Inspector, Miss Marple said cheerfully as she walked him to the front door. He will understand entirely, or if he does not, it will give him something worthwhile to ponder during his evening pipe. With a polite tip of his hat and a warm, genuine smile of farewell, Inspector Slack stepped out onto the garden path, his boots crunching lightly against the gravel as he made his way down the lane toward the village station. Miss Marple stood on the porch for a moment, watching him go until his tall figure turned the corner past the post office. The afternoon sun was beginning its golden descent behind the church spire, casting long, peaceful shadows across the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. From somewhere down the road came the cheerful sound of children laughing as they chased a stray hoop past the green, accompanied by the distant, comforting chime of the church clock marking the hour. Returning inside her parlor, Miss Marple closed the front door softly, bolted it with a quiet click, and walked back to her armchair by the bay window. Picking up her basket, she selected a fresh ball of pale blue wool and let her needles resume their gentle rhythmic dance, clack, 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 keeping time with the quiet heartbeat of the village. The snow was gone, the garden was blooming, and beneath the tranquil surface of St. Mary Mead, the world turned on its axis once more, safe in the timeless, watchful care of its most unassuming resident.